AAPLOG, which is very much a propaganda religious machine. They say none of the things that I'm going to give you examples of are actually abortion. That is false. Only 1.5% of terminations happen after 20 weeks. Viability is like 23 weeks. There are situations of survival less than that, but that is pretty rare and definitely not, it's a gray area. All right, I get that. But any abortion happening after 20 weeks, first off, is going to be rare. Second, many of them, especially in the ones who are born alive, are going to be having abortions for lethal anomalies and be induced. This is still considered an abortion. Something that you will often see when people talk about this is they'll say things like, and this is a propaganda point that is largely pushed by AAPLOG, which is a not real medical association who is very much a propaganda religious machine that says they are pro-life ObGyns, and the reason they have hardly any members compared to the vast majority of people who are ObGyns that are members of ACOG is because you will be hard-pressed to find very many obstetricians who think that abortion should be criminalized. AAPLOG had at some point said abortion is never medically necessary. First, I will tell you why they say things like this, and it is because they're trying to change language, okay? What they do with this is they say none of the things that I'm going to give you examples of are actually abortion. That is false. Every scenario that I list for you here is abortion and would be affected by abortion laws, and you need to be aware of that. There are, in fact, some states that do make a exception for when the life of the person who's pregnant is in danger. And to that I say, one, we shouldn't have to worry about when we can cross that line or not, right? How in danger does my patient need to be before I can intervene? In pregnancy, you are always at an increased risk of anything that can happen to you in life. So you're at a higher risk of hemorrhage and death and homicide and suicide and domestic violence and pulmonary embolism and stroke and hypertension and every single thing, okay? So you're always at an increased risk of everything, including death, while you are pregnant as compared to when you are not pregnant. So knowing that, when they put in these laws that are like, if there is a medical need, like the person's life is in danger, tell me when that happens, right? All right, so we can all look at someone who is actively bleeding to death and go, okay, that is a medical emergency, right? You don't have to be a doctor to tell me that. What about somebody who is 8 weeks pregnant? They were using contraception, not that that matters, but they were, and they have Marfan syndrome. They have a dilated aortic root, which means that they are extremely high risk for having a complication during this pregnancy that kills them. All right, we know this at 6 weeks. Although at 6 weeks, everything's fairly fine. Their vitals are fine. They're normal. They're feeling fine. Nothing's going wrong. All right. When is it okay to terminate that pregnancy? Should I wait until the person is actually having a physical manifestation of the Marfan syndrome and dilated aortic root? Or should I do it early? Well, I would say if the person wants to abort the pregnancy, I should do it early because that is in the best interest of their health. It also makes the abortion less risky for them, and it's earlier, and we would like to have less later abortions, right? All right, that makes sense. But that would be very hard to do in places like Texas at the moment. So when does the line cross where we go, okay, actually now we can intervene? So a 19-week pregnant patient presents via EMS and they're hemorrhaging. They have a placenta previa and they lost 1 liter of blood at the scene. They have transfusions going. Her 6-year-old's there. They would really like you to save their mom's life. And what do you do now? Any scenario where you stop that bleeding, unless it just stops on its own, which is not common if they're bleeding that much, is an abortion. Okay, so when AAPLOG says abortion is never medically necessary, what they mean is actually in that scenario you just listed at 19 weeks with a massive hemorrhage, if you do a hysterotomy and take the baby out, then that's not an abortion. That is an abortion. So they're trying to change the language to fit into their box, which I always find to be extremely problematic because that's not what happens when they write the laws. The continual insistence to play around with language and change language is a very intentional thing that has been done. And I was just reading another study, okay? Man, we're really off the rails, but we're going to talk about this one too because it's relevant here. The intentional changing of language around this topic is very problematic, and we can see that based on a study. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, AAPLOG, AAPLOG is something I've talked about before. This is the Association of Pro-Life ObGyns, which is not a, it's a propaganda machine just like every other anti-choice advocacy group. They like to say things like abortion is never medically necessary, which we all know is false, right? But a lot of times people struggle to combat because they don't know why a professional organization of doctors would say such a thing. And so this is something that is oftentimes really clung to by the anti-choice group because they then go, look, see, now I have a reason to say that it's never medically necessary. Well, that's because they're changing language. And the problem with changing language is exactly this, that we have research to support something I have long thought, which is that reclassifying these pregnancies as not being abortion because they were either wanted or they were periviable, meaning like 22 weeks or whatever it was, is incredibly endangering to the health of people who are pregnant. And you can see here in this study, they've gone through, and it's just a survey response. So there's going to be some problems with this, but it still is, I think, very valuable data where they sent out some studies to OBGYNs and asked them to detail if they would consider a pregnancy ending intervention for 22-week intrauterine infection to be classified as an induced abortion. And they have said that half would not consider that an abortion. And this is a direct effect of changing of language in order to fit comfort levels because the word abortion was hijacked by politics, okay? Does this mean that your patient has to say, I had an abortion? No, that's stupid. If that's not the language that they feel comfortable with, then that's not the language they have to use. But the people providing the care have to continue to classify intentional pregnancy ending procedures as abortion when they are done knowing that the fetus will not survive. Because this is important to making sure that the law is not confusing. Does this make sense? Does what I'm saying make sense? And then the implication that they've said here is that under unclear legal definitions, legislative interference, and administrative overreach, subjectivity and classification creates inconsistency in care for pregnancy complications. Failure to classify life-saving care as abortion contributes to stigma and facilitates restrictions with increasing danger and less autonomy for pregnant people. Who are the authors on this study? I'm going to look up this person. This is like, they put into words and numbers something that I have tried to find a better way to say for years, and something that I knew was a problem for years, but didn't know how to phrase it. And I am so thankful that this study exists. There you go. Epic queen. Thank you for doing this work and writing this paper, Rachel.